Code of Rule, Part 2. Morgoth scanned his retinue with both heads going back and forth expressionlessly, as though he were appraising a series of banquet selections or a palmful of bedding rocks. High Counselor Verag, pulling an 8-wheeled, cloth-covered cart twice his size, had already benefited immensely from his pain learning. Though his face was downcast, he voiced no further gripes. Even as his yellow robes were spattered by tiny flecks of mud, he was, for the moment, assisted in his labors by Korath. Unlike Verog in his robes, the Breaker was dressed for war, bearing piecemeal metal armor and a wicked, skull-topped war club. His bare head and heavily muscled, tattooed arms remained exposed, as it was with all in Morgoth's band. A fashionable display among the High Mall would not be neglected for the threat of extinction. Unable to reconcile himself to a diplomatic mission, while High Mall lay besieged, Korath had frowned until Varric, unprompted, ordered him to make a better face. Verog's pain learning benefited others too. Verog might be ambitious, and Korath willful and dull, but both were mighty, highly placed ogres who performed exceptionally in battle drills, rose early, and had survived grievous wounds. Korath, disembowelment, and Verog, a cut to the thigh that he allowed to putrefy to prove his strength, with dozens of kills behind them. The Imperator had selected the rest of his traveling retinue from centurions outside the council, listening attentively to their accomplishments, if not their names. One slumbered inside a lava dome for years, until its magma was at its back and call. One was a Coliseum favorite who tore the claws from 10 great predators and sewed them into his fighting gloves. One had a connection with the mountain so strong that no arrow could pierce his skin. All could carry a 2-ton stone to the rise without rest. The Centurions had never seen the Imperator in the flesh before. To be traveling with their king set their tongues abuzz. Morgoth led them lumbering from the front, trying to ignore the distraction of their chatter, his heads occasionally turning inward to peer, annoyed, and at each other until he grew dizzy. Silence them, let them gawk. The ground melted into soft mud where he trod, permitting his entourage to trudge off the rise and down the hillside without falling, their makeshift ramp returning to stony impassability behind them every few steps. Then they walk faster, the cart tearing muddy furrows in the ground. Verog remarked that now the orcs would have their first road, and even the Imperator permitted himself one head's small smirk. With mountainous strides, the ogres reached their destination after sunrise, though the Imperator remained quiet. His retinue's banter was proud throughout the journey. His people were born at the beginning, when the great forgers squeezed the light from the enormous ball of fire that would become Draenor. They made ogres from the same smoking clay and gave them dominion over stone and earth. The very world was theirs. Their capital was tall atop the scaffolding of the past. None among them that High Mall's defenders had fought through the night, that the entire empire yet stood, until they laid eyes on Gromashar. When last Morgoth had seen the war camp, it had been flimsy, movable, wood, leather, huts, and shanties placed gingerly atop the earth. He had pictured the orcs' downcast faces when wind and rain knocked down their homes, and they reacted with dumb dismay, wondering why it happened. Now it aspired to be a citadel, razor-sharp palisades encircling it. Ferociously armed orcs of many clans patrolled walls with murder holes carved into their capstones, and everywhere were the trouble-clanking machines, belching more smoke and fire than they had flung over High Mall's ramparts. The ogres lumbered openly through Gromashar under an Isat's flag of parley. Morgoth ripped one of his own purple and gold standards down the middle, but the orcs had raised no alarm at their entry, as though the ogres were expected. Only the immense cloth-covered cart drew stares.
"What is that?"
past a burly armored orc standing at the head of 20, all with handheld cannons pointed, burnished metal glinting in the sunlight. Verog worked. Crusty snot free from his nostrils and rose to his full height, his palms black and ragged pink from a day burdened by the cart. Kolra excitedly shifted his grip on the skull-headed club he carried. They were far outnumbered. The terrain was unfamiliar, the enemy eager. Wit, openness, misdirection. "It is but tribute," Verog muttered before Morgok could say anything. It sufficed. A few of the Iron Horde stood sniffing guard over the cart, lifting the cloth, inspecting what lay beneath. What could they possibly see? The ogre's enormous weapons were heaved into the Zangar Sea, though several spear points still poked out of the water despite the Gromashar soldiers' best attempts to bury them. The orcs were infuriatingly small, with minuscule veins visible in their arms, tiny droplets of sweat beading on their faces. Everything about them taut, compressed, close to the surface, as though they had no room in their bodies. The Imperator demanded an action from his retinue as they suffered, the indigenous of diplomacy. Only his gaze maintained obeisance, while they were led before Grommash Hellscream. For all that his home had changed, Grommash had not. The Scourge of Nogrond looked no different from when Morgok had last seen him at the head of a war party. Mane of thick hair flowing, muscled like an animal, lips peeled back and teeth flashing in a snarl. What did surprise Morgok was the throne that Grommash now leaned against, a gnarled tree whose thick wood seemed uncomfortable and unlikely to persist for even the next generation of war-song chieftains. He recognized this particular tree and the pains the orc must have gone through to retrieve it. Grommash had spent quite some time tied to the tree during the reign of the last Sorcerer King. After a failed raid against Highmaul, Grommash had been captured, beaten, and starved within an inch of his life. And then, a brown, rot-necked ogre head stared down from the boughs of the tree with empty eye sockets, even with only faint bits of identifying flesh still clinging to the skull. Morgok was fairly certain he recognized it. It would have been impossible to anticipate his predecessor's death for so long without imagining, with reasonable accuracy, how his head would appear if removed. "Imperator," Grommash intoned on his liquid bass. "What do you think of the last Ogre Lord who opposed me?" He did not give way to theatricality, did not even move from his spot, though the gesture of dominance was clear. His eyes were intent-focused, feeling the needles of a few moments' silence. The ogres looked to their king. "I think he was a fool," boomed Morgok. Verog relaxed his hands. They unclasped, went to his sides. "He was a fool for not killing you." A low hiss came from an orc near the throne, and Verog and Kolrath both tensed, hands reaching instinctively for absent weapons. "If I had held your life," Morgok continued, "I would have slit your throat in front of my prisoners and dumped your rotting bodies in the ocean. Then I would have dumped them beside you." He pointed at the orcs behind himself. "Your people were broken. The Highmaul would rule all Nogrond by now." Rule all Nogrond again. Morgok always gave way to theatricality when it was warranted. Grommash did not flinch. Unfazed by the casual discussion of his murder, he was the luxury. From behind the throne stepped several more orcs, now numbering 24 with eyesight alone. One broad-shouldered, with a face full of tattoos, barely distinguishable beneath his brown hood, leaned to whisper something in Hellscream's ear. When had he ever taken advice? "I see," Grommash returned, empty. "Then tell me of the worth of the Highmaul. Tell me of this tribute you have brought me and the value of your lives. It was not lost on the Imperator that the position of the sun was forcing him to squint and slightly incline his heads. He resisted the urge to tear out a tree and shade his eyes with it. Grommash rests every day on a relic of his grudges. Any bargain must be simple and to his obvious advantage. Morgok snorted.
Very well. The gift I bring you is knowledge. The Iron Horde is weak.
Now Grommash smiled.
You say this as we shatter the walls of your home.
He motioned at a spot behind the ogre, as best as their size permitted.
Tell them what you have seen.
Another orc darted to Hellscream's side, and Morgok recognized the scar-faced messenger who had first pronounced war upon his people. A pity. He had hoped she had been killed in the siege. Her face was fiercely proud.
We've broken the Highmaul line at the entrance of their city. The mountain is surrounded. They fall back to their homes.
Morgok had suspected that might happen, but not nearly so fast. It was a ruse. It had to be. For just a moment, while his people argued among themselves and the orcs relished the chaos, Morgok closed his eyes, trying to imagine the scene. The ogres losing ground, fighting in the streets, melted rocks from ruined mound homes, pooling around the legs of Goryons in formation. He did not have to tax himself to picture the orcs surrounding his legions. The teeth of their weapons, buzzing as they sheared off ogre legs, sent them toppling onto the stumps. He had seen it too many times already. Next, the orcs would pull his statues down. His men, women, and children would roar and rally, fight back, chanting for him ceaselessly.
The king! The king!
The more they say it, the less it sounded like a fitting death cry. Surely they had clung to those syllables for so long because they were easier to holler than Imperator. Not because they couldn't pronounce his title, his name. Surely they would hold. Morgok grew tired of imagining and opened his eyes. Exhaling, he turned to Kolroth and Varog, who were murmuring audibly. Their posture was defensive. Judging by their faces, they too believed the messenger. They became quiet when Grommash spoke up.
Now explain to me, Imperator,
he said, as confident as though he had seen through Morgok's mind,
how the Iron Horde is weak.
Finally.
Do not misunderstand me, War Chief. You are great in number. Perhaps your orcs will eventually fight their way to the very tops of Highmaul.
The Imperator began to pace, gesturing animatedly.
But you will not do it without cost. For your lack of our greatest strength, you face the army of a sorcerer king. Our tradition are as old as Draenor.
He raised both arms to the crowd, squeezed behemoth fists.
We will call down rock slides from within our homes, terrify your wolves with fire, rust your metal with mud. The magic of your shaman cannot touch us. We will laugh at their false thunder and squash their skulls into dust.
At this, Grommash looked almost intrigued. The orcs worshipped elements. How typical of little beings to look for something outside themselves to praise.
And,
Morgok could not resist adding,
you are small. Even if you claim Highmaul, you will lose a year simply removing our dead.
Morgok put down the chisel of his words and shut his mouth decisively. The mighty praise their physical prowess and stature above all others, the quick-witted, their limitless and enduring minds, their charismatic, their leadership and persuasiveness. But true strength had always been all strengths. This is why he was king. And Grommash would be haunted by those thoughts of any strength he did not possess. Morgok knew nothing else intimately enough to chance that it would spare his empire, his life. Hellscream's retort was swift.
We do not want your city. We want your corpses.
As he stood, his left hand tightened around the handle of a jagged axe nearly as tall as he was, with same-day blood darkening to umber on the edge.
All in the Iron Horde are willing to die in battle. We are winning. Your threat is empty.
Kolroth became riled at that. But Mordkok held the hand in front of him as Grommash snarled, curled into contemplation.
You speak but one truth. Your magic is powerful. Teach it to us, and some of you will live.
End of part 2.